So is Izzy in the class with you beforehand, before the class, or
We
not?
didn't have Sheila's class today.
Okay, so just checking to see if she might have been in class or not. Well, I suppose we can get started. Lecture 19. So we had a defective wheel on Monday. Does anybody think we need to go over the measurements, maybe delay things a bit?
Like an actual wheel or like?
The wheel that you were using on the ground was not recording every foot it measured.
Oh.
Somewhere along the line, if you look down and watch the wheel, it would stop.
I noticed that once, but then I reset it and it seemed fine, but.
It seemed fine, so if your numbers seem off, that would be the problem. So you guys used it on silo 5, right? And we figured it out by 1, 2, 3, 4. So are you comfortable with your measurements on silo 5?
The only thing I worry about is if it's fixed now and.
It's not fixed, it's broken.
Okay, just us getting different numbers then.
Well, do we want to go over those in some way, shape, or form, or you want me to provide some to you that I think are more accurate, or what I consider accurate? You can compare them to yours. Okay, so let me try to do that today. I have to get, both of them are busted. I can take them apart and I can fix them, but it's probably not, they don't last very long, so it's probably not the best use of my time, so I have to submit a essential purchase request in this time of COVID. Normally I get like $1,000 for teaching supplies. We don't get that anymore, so I have to request for everything. So I will send or post rough bunk dimensions. So what'd you use the wheel for? You remember? Probably going along the top of the wall?
Yeah, that's it.
Did you use it for anything else?
No.
We used it for all 4 silos.
So what were you doing? Were you doing the distance in?
And the distance of the wall too.
When you were up on the wall, so you were focusing on the length measurements, not the width. We gave you the width.
How far back the feed was. And then we were measuring.
On top of the wall, what sections were.
Yeah.
So both groups focused on length measurements for the wheel, not height measurements, and I gave you width measurements.
Yeah.
So I'll give you some length measurements and we'll see how they compare. Does that sound reasonable?
Yeah.
To fix that? So the focus will be on length. Monday, I'm going to try to do 2 different things. One, we're going to talk about the scientific method. And the other is we're going to get into the parlor and try to monitor some milking procedures. So using using a spreadsheet that we come up with, how well are we doing in the parlor? Are we doing contact time long enough? Is the dip on that minimum 30 seconds? Is from wipe, which we'll say is the main stimulation for milk let down to attachment, are we getting into that 1 to 2 minute window? Is it where we need to be? So we'll have some opportunity. I think we're going to be all together next week. The week after, judging team's gone, right? So I forget what I'm gonna do there. And then hopefully we'll get out on a farm in the weeks following that. We've got milking lab or milk watching lab. We've got the scientific method. We've got the hoof lab, and then we've got a management lab, and we want to get out on a farm possibly and add a question.
Are we still trying to do the other singeing or no?
Probably somewhere along the line, but I have to see when the crew wants to do that, so, or if they want to at all, so, we can fit that in somewhere along the line. The problem is during lab, they're probably done milking fairly quickly, so, how are we gonna get that done? I don't know, so we'll have to talk about that. Rest of the semester. Next lab, we're going to talk about milking, scientific method. Second exam is going to be November 10th. Last exam will be during finals week. So I'll have to check with Justin or Amanda to see when they want to do, if they want to do. Any questions for the class? So we've been through all these areas. Cow comfort, reproduction, milking, feeding and nutrition, production, composition. I think we've split those. We did nutrition and production, composition, and back to feeding. And now we're going to talk about somatic cell and bacteria in the milk. So everybody here knows what a somatic cell is in our milk. A cell from the body, usually or mostly white blood cells, but we can also have tissue that's sloughed off. Our measurements, there's two different ways we can measure those: somatic cell count and somatic cell score. If we're looking at somatic cell count, 200,000 equals a somatic cell score of 4. And that is the cutoff we assume or use for when an animal crosses from uninfected below those numbers to infected above those numbers. So over 200,000 somatic cell count, cells per milliliter. Somatic cell score of above a 4, we assume they are infected either subclinically or clinically. As we start from that 200,000, every time we go up 1 somatic cell score, the somatic cell count doubles. So that, if you're going to graph that out, that looks like that. I think I have that graph here somewhere. Should be the second sheet. So the purpose of somatic cell score is to take the bias out of the average. If you average all your cows, 1 or 2 cows out here will affect your average dramatically. We take that cow out, we can have huge drops in somatic cell average. So that score is meant to take that out, that bias or that outlier effect. But if we put all cows in the tank, this is going to be more reflective of what's in the tank. So depending on using your somatic cell count is, in theory, what you may have or getting paid for if you don't segregate any of your milk. We look at legal limits. I think the national legal limit is still below 750,000.
That's a lot.
Yep. Most co-ops have gone to 400,000. They're looking for excuses to kick you off, kick you out of their co-op or their processing. They're going to ask for 400,000 or less. Does everybody know what the magic of 400,000 is? The European Union. If you want to sell it internationally, your milk has to be below 400,000.
Why would they even have the average, the domestic average that high?
You mean the cutoffs that high? Historic, I guess. These things were probably established even before I was born as a level, and we didn't have as good of mastitis control or sanitation as we do now. We didn't realize that lower somatic cell has a whole big advantages for milk products. The cheese yields are higher on lower somatic cell milk. They taste better. You don't have all the off funny tastes that are associated with that high somatic cell. So it's not something certain I had never heard when I was growing up. I don't think my father ever mentioned it once. Historically, we were in the low 200,000s forever. And then there started to be this competition in where does your milk go? We got too much milk. I don't want your milk anymore. I'll find any reason to stop using it or stop picking it up. That competition has driven down those somatic, national and average somatic cell count scores for the first time. So New York average in 2017 was 288. It had been like 210, 220 for years. But that competition, that co-ops, the people buying your milk say, this is what I want. This is what I'll accept. If you don't get it below this, I will not pick up your milk anymore. So that's either driven people out of business or driven them to get their act together as far as somatic cell is concerned. National average does about the same thing. Used to be 250-ish forever. The competition again and these buyers of milk saying, this is what I want, or you're not going to sell here, has driven down that national average. It's continuing to drop because of what the buyers are requiring or needing, and a lot of people going out of business, so things more competitive. So you're having that overall drop, which is a good thing. Unfortunately, it might be too late. If we're selling somatic cell, high somatic cell milk, it's got a funny taste to it. If that was enough to put people off milk, generally they don't come back. Does everybody know what they used to make chocolate milk out of? They used to use that to hide the high somatic cell milk. The chocolate covered up the taste. I don't think that happens anymore, but that was a way to deal with it. You knew a farm was going to have high somatic cell, you pasteurize it and throw chocolate at it.
I'm smart.
From their perspective, yes. But we're talking about funny tastes and the consumer. The consumer is always right. So we've got the driving down of those average somatic cell counts. So the blue are the ones that are under 200,000. I'm surprised California is still up above there, given the cheese plants and stuff they're dealing with. But I'm sure they're pretty close to 200. So the majority of country is below 300,000. So that's the green and the blue. We've got some challenges down in here. What do you think the somatic cell challenges might be associated with those regions?
Hot weather.
hot weather, well, you got hot weather out here. Hot and moist, humid. So you've got the moisture coming up through Texas, gets deposited through here. There's a line that runs through Texas and Oklahoma where on this side it tends to be wet, on this side it tends to be dry. That moisture brought up from the Gulf. So hotter, longer, humid, longer. So high somatic cell, if it's too high, you will lose milk production. So the somatic cells moving into the milk will destroy secretory tissue. Not just the flare-up or the infection, but the chronic movement of somatic cells. If you're moving those millions of cells every day, you got more coming in to replace them. You're going to destroy secretory tissue, and if you pop that secretory cell off in early lactation, it's going to be gone at least till next lactation, maybe forever. So you're going to lose milk from all those cells that don't stay in the udder and produce milk. You're also going to lose premiums. This, when you start to add it up, is serious money, or can be serious money left on the table. If I can pull out 1 or 2 cows, can I get my milk down low enough where the removal of that hundredweight is less than what I've gained on premiums for the rest of the herd? So identifying, when I was at Michigan State, they'd identify usually 4 quarters in the herd that were throwing all the somatic cells. They had a quarter milker. Has anybody seen a quarter milker before? It's basically a drop bucket that fits on where the long milk tube is. So you've got the teacup, it goes into a drop bucket, and then the air goes back in through. So you're basically taking the milk from 1 quarter, not a lot, usually the size of a basketball, is the quarter milker sitting there. And from a shift perspective, they used to get pissed when they got up to 80,000. They freaked out. But since they're a research farm and they had some of the bells and whistles, they had an on-farm somatic cell tester that was more accurate than a CMT.
Is this thing?
That is a quarter milker, yeah. So could you show the rest of the class there? That ball. So taking 2, 3, 4 quarters out can probably drop you to the next premium level. The challenge is identifying which quarters they are. So you can do it with the somatic cell reports. How many people really use those somatic cell reports when they come back? Not a whole lot. In Michigan State, Randy, as soon as that report get in, give me that. I got to identify which cows get quarter milked. So trying to keep that premium up, trying to get the full 50 cents at the time by getting down below 100,000.
So did they just dump that quarter then?
Yep, just dump it. So you're talking on a milking, maybe 40 pounds. So if I've got 150 animals that are producing 80 pounds, I'm looking at a half a cow dumped. So maybe, half a hundredweight gone, but on all the rest of the hundredweights, I'm getting another 25 cents. So that becomes the issue. You can start taking all the high somatic cell animals out, but when do you drop below where your volume dollars takes a greater hit than your premium dollars? So it becomes a mathematical problem. And if you're pulling out that many hundredweights, maybe you need to look at what the cause is or what the problem is as opposed to just segregation. So this is, I mentioned this before. I know you haven't seen it before, but this is the research study that kind of went through and said, what is the somatic cell count loss associated with either the linear score or the somatic cell count? And this is hundreds of thousands. So we've got 200,000 here. that we're moving into. We're going to lose 400 pounds per lactation for our first lactation animals, 800 pounds per lactation for our second and greater lactation animals. Has anybody seen on the DHI 202, it says milk lost for the month? I don't know if we had that, we still have that on ours or not. But that's based on this table. You go through, figure out which cows are at which level and how much milk are you going to lose over the course of a lactation. And then they say for this month, that's how much you lost because of that higher individual animals on their somatic cell count.
Is it the 30-day herd production loss from high somatic cell count?
Yep, that's it.
So
that's based on this table. How many cows do you have in each of these categories? Divide that by 12 or 10. And then you figure out, okay, I lost this much milk this month because of select cows being too high in somatic cell.
It's $822 and $41.49.
So they're getting a little bit more aggressive. Is that our Marsville's or somebody else's? Is that one of the homework ones or?
I think this is the test one, the take-home test one.
Okay, so that's probably our herd. Yeah, that's our herd. So depending on where your cutoffs are, how much you're losing. So if I lost that much in a month, the idea is to call your attention to it and saying you're leaving money on the table because of higher somatic cell. From a premium perspective and from a volume shipped perspective. So if you're doing a farm evaluation and they've got a somatic cell problem, you don't run into those as much as you used to, just because of the fire pressures, but this is what you can use. I got 20 animals that are a 6 or greater. That's costing me on average 1,200 pounds per lactation. If that's, we round it to $20, 1,200, 240 bucks, I think. So that's what it's costing me. What I'm leaving on the table. Is there an opportunity to fix that? What could I do that's cheaper to fix that? So with high somatic cell, you're trying to figure out which animals are infected. It'd also be helpful to know what they're infected with, but let's start with which ones are infected. So you're looking for patterns. Is it across lactation, first versus third or greater? Is it early lactation or late lactation? Is it fresh cows? Is it dry cows? Where is that somatic cell, high somatic cell occurring? So certainly we can, if they report it down here, we look for the tank somatic cell to give us a feel for the herd. And then we're going over on the back and we start looking for patterns. So we've got our breakdown, uninfected, subclinical, clinical cows. Is there certain times of the year where we see higher infection rates? So we can use this down here to look at patterns for the herd for seasons. Now there's certain times of the year where things are higher. Are there certain lactations that are higher in somatic cell than others? So first, second, third lactation, what proportion of animals are, or what number of animals are clean and which ones are not? We want to push over here where we push to the right, and then given the number of animals in each of these categories, it predicts the amount of milk lost or money lost, milk and money lost in your last month. since your last test day because of the somatic cell in that group. As you can see, that number has room to get fairly big. We look at stages of lactation, lactation number. We're looking for places where there's higher infection rates. Do they start clean and get dirty as the lactation goes on, or they start high and drop off? Is it a function that the longer they're in the herd, the worse they get? Looking for patterns in who's infected, who's not, and what the differences between the two are. So if we plot previous somatic cell by current somatic cell, we're going to get a graph that looks like this. And that's really a function of this one cow that was 6 million last month and 6 million this month. Basically pushed all the other animals down here, so it's not really useful. So this is if we convert things to previous linear score versus linear score. So last month linear score versus this month's linear score. We still have that animal up in the corner there, but instead of 100,000 versus 6 million, which is going to skew things, we basically put her at a 9 and leave her there. Now that, taking out that outlier pressure or outlier bias, we can start to see all of our individual animals. So in dairy comp, has everybody seen this graph before? You put your cursor on each one, it will identify which animal it is. So it's helpful to pull up this graph and put these crossbars in. I think sometimes they'll put them in for you, but you can certainly put them in mentally, or as I've done here, just draw them in on the PowerPoint. So this is my previous somatic scale linear score, somatic cell score. This is my current one. We've got 4 quadrants here that separate infected from uninfected. We've got them at the 4s. So less than a 4, this area should be uninfected, uninfected. So if we establish these crossbars, what do we know about this group here? They're uninfected this month and they're uninfected last month. So that group down here, it's in your handout. This should be your uninfected group, your clean group. This quadrant up here, what do we know about these animals? They are infected this month and last month. So we call these 2 months in a row, we'll call those chronically infected. Chronic infections. Now, depending on which way, as you do the graph, doesn't matter which one is on which axis, this will always be the uninfected, this will always be the chronics, but depending on where these two end up, what order you put them in, these 2 quadrants can flip. On this graph, what do we know about this group?
They're infected this month, but they weren't last month.
So these are the new infections that have happened in the last month. So currently infected, last month they were not. So something happened to these animals across the month to spur a new infection. The question is, what happened? This group is what?
Previously infected.
So they were previously high last month. They are not infected this month. We'll call these cured. So where do we want everybody?
Bottom left.
Down here. So we want to push this graph down to here. But again, trying to figure out which animals are which. Why is this group different from this group? This group different from this group, this group different from this group. You're trying to look for differences. What is the difference between the infected animals and uninfected animals? And that's where we start to find the reasons or the causes. So, for this graph, the one I printed out, you've got your healthy or uninfected animals down in the corner, your chronic infections up here, new infections down here on this particular graph, and the cured animals up on the other side. So, who's up in this category? Who's in this category? Who's in this category? What do we know about those animals? And how are they different from each other? And in therein lies, hopefully, the reasons why all that is happening. So if you've got problems with somatic cell, you certainly want to check the milking procedures. Do we have a standard operating procedure, a method that we're going to use? For a while, those things were very much posted here in New York. Those things were posted in every parlor. This is how we're going to do things. This is what we want you to do. We talked about consistency and gentle cow handling to get milking done correctly. If we don't do that, what happens? Won't let down. You've got residual milk in the udder. You're going to build up that pressure faster. There's going to be leakage, stuff coming out. The opportunity for that milk to be sucked back up and in and for an infection. You want to check for mastitis procedures. Does anybody check for mastitis? Or is it a machine thing? On a robot farm, they're measuring temperature, they're measuring somatic cell to flag those animals in one way, shape, or form. Once we've determined that there's a quarter that's infected, what do? What are the procedures on the farm? How do we handle that? What do we treat it with? There, at least historically, are a lot of farms that treat with drugs that you'd be better off squirting it on the ground than putting it in the cow. Depending on the organism that you have for mastitis, a lot of people use penicillin because penicillin is cheap, but there is a class, several classes of mastitis causing organisms that don't respond to penicillin. They are unaffected by it. So you're better off putting it on the ground than chancing getting it hot in the tank. The problems therein. Do we have cow cultures on this farm? Do we have quarter cultures? Has anybody been in to check things? Do they do any sort of testing on farm? Has anybody seen those auger plates that get done on farm? You get an opportunity to do those in the spring, at least I hope. Bulk tank cultures, if you don't have anything else, sending in a tank test. What's the problem with a bulk tank culture?
I don't know where the problem comes from.
Don't know where the problem comes from, and what?
It's all contaminated.
It's maybe all contaminated, but it also may be a function if you got one cow. All the milk from that one cow is on this side of the tank for some reason. It's like if you go down to a river and you take a bucket and you put it in the water and you take it out and you look in and there's no fish in there. Does that mean there's no fish in?
Absolutely.
There you go. So it comes down to sampling. You may have dilution. You may miss an organism if it's not there enough. But if something comes up in a bulk tank culture, that usually means there's something, you got a real problem with that particular organism. There are enough cows in the herd so that you can detect it in a milk sample. So one of the things that I like to look at is the bulk tank somatic cell. count. But maybe I need to get away from that because the bulk tank somatic cell versus the actual herd somatic cell count might tell two different stories. So what might we look for bulk tank somatic cell? You want something below 200,000. So what are the ways that we could get below 200,000?
Hygiene and milk.
So hygiene, milking, you got a clean herd. What's the other way? You pull out all the high somatic cell cows and you only ship your clean milk. So you might be biased that maybe there isn't a mastitis problem, or maybe they're just really good at keeping it out of the tank. So that's one of the reasons where when you're on DHI test, they do the actual herd thing there with all milk accounted for, all cows mathematically included in whatever that is. So check your bulk tank somatic cell and then make sure you ask the question, how many animals weren't in that tank? If they say, 24, well, maybe we need to take a look at mastitis, even though the tank says there isn't a problem. If you're pulling out 24 animals, maybe you need to think about what you're doing and what you're achieving on your farm. So, any questions on somatic cell counts? Bacteria, usually the milk inspector's right on top of those and solving those before you would get to the farm. So herd health. Basically, we're coming down to mortality and morbidity. Mortality is the animals that die. Morbidity is the animals that get sick. So in theory, mortality is a subset of morbidity. So how many of your calves get sick? How many of them die? We expect the sick number to be greater than the ones that die number.
You said, I'm sorry, mortality is which one?
Mortality is animals that die, death, mortal. And morbidity is the portion or percentage or number that gets sick. How many are morbid? How many are mortal? Would be interesting to see a cow get mortal. When we start to look at which animals die on the farm, we want to think about age group. Where are we losing our animals? Is it our calves? Is it our cows? Is it our dry cows? Is it our fresh cows? What group is dying on the farm? With that information, we can start to address that, well, maybe this is the problem or that's the problem. Again, separating what's the difference between the animals that die versus the animals that live. And that difference should tell you what the problem is. It might be by age group, or we might do it by building. So buildings can be sick as well. And then we need to be concerned about the number of animals that get sick. And we know certain sicknesses will set that animal back more or less their entire lifetime. We get a severe case and a bad enough case of pneumonia, that animal will never catch up from what she's lost. Has anybody seen that one that's really, really bad scarred lungs and it's fighting for every breath to the point where you can see the muscles flex between the ribs on every breath? They're going every time. So all the muscles that are associated with breathing, moving air in and out, keep that animal alive. You're spending more energy on just breathing than a normal, not sick never sick animal. They're going to spend so much energy that their maintenance costs go high, and they don't have enough left over for milk production. So from a business perspective, it's probably not the best idea to raise some of those severely sick animals. You're not going to get a good return on the money you invest in that animal to keep them around. So dividing the animals into the group, we're going to check on our 202s. We're going to check culling. Why are animals leaving the herd? Which culling is the same as dying on some level. Where are they going? Why are they leaving the herd? So when we're thinking about culling, we want to think about the rate of culling. So among our lactating cows, if we're up in the 40s, that means our herd is probably shrinking in size. All things being equal, if we're in the 30s, turning over about a third of our herd each year, we're probably holding steady. If we're trying to grow, we're doing a real good job, we might be down in that 20% turnover each year. Somewhere in the 20s. So we think when we're looking at evaluating culling, we got to know which animals are being culled. The question is why? What are their issues? What are the problems that we're dealing with? And is our culling involuntary or voluntary? Involuntary in the sense that that animal's dead, there's nothing I can do about it, or she will be dead shortly, there's nothing I can fix. She's forced out of the herd for some reason. Versus, I got to get rid of 5 animals, I'm going to pick you, you, and you. That's voluntary. Usually we've got more animals in the voluntary culling region, we're usually doing a little bit better than if we're losing everything to involuntary. The involuntary can be particularly frustrating if we're losing those animals that we spend a lot of time, energy, and passion on. We need to ask if animals are getting sick, is it a metabolic issue? Are the things that aren't contagious? We've just messed up their metabolism in some way, shape, or form, pushed into the problem. Or are we dealing with a virus, a bacteria, something infectious that passes from animal to animal? So different pathologies, different mechanisms for why we'll have metabolic versus infectious. So what are we dealing with? How do we fix those? Those are 2 different ways to be. On a farm, is it a valid vet-client relationship, the vet-animal relationship? There, are they being advised or being visited by a vet on a regular basis? I think to ship milk in New York, you have to have one of those. When you're having health issues, you need to take a look at their vaccination plan. So what is their vaccination plan and how well do they carry that out? How often does it actually happen? And when they do it, are they doing it in a way that they're going to get a good vaccination response? I know I certainly have an issue when I get vaccinated. I got my COVID vaccination. I was flat out for the next day. I think I slept 16, 18 hours the next day.
Sounds wonderful.
It has that potential, but I did have a response to it. Are we making sure that everything's refrigerated, everything's handled, so we're not contaminating, we're not decreasing the effectiveness of that vaccine? Are we making sure we get the full benefit of the product we purchased? So what are our SOPs related to health? How do we clean things? How do we vaccinate things? How do we move animals from one place to another? How do we dehorn? Where are the stressors? What do we do to minimize that stress if we can? And again, when we're evaluating the health program, What is it about the healthy, and what is it about the unhealthy? If we put all the unhealthy animals over here, all the healthy, mentally, all the healthy animals over here, what's different between the two? Is it an age thing? Is it a size thing? Is it a health thing? Is it a calving difficulty thing? What is the difference between those two groups? And in that difference, you should be able to find your answer and your solution. It's pretty straightforward. Any questions on that? So next time we'll talk about replacements. I have a handout here for you, followed by a quiz. But somebody actually went, and I suggested this in class, went and looked at, is it better to be lying down or is it better to be standing up when you're ruminating? It appears that there are additional benefits to rumination if you're lying down, recumbent rumination. So with these new systems going into place that can tell when an animal is lying, or at least where she's located in a barn, and when she's ruminating, how many hours a day are associated with ruminating, and then the posture things, is she standing up, is she lying down? If we can get those two things together, is she lying down and is she ruminating? There's some new stuff that's certainly going to be a lot more clarified in your lifetime, but it appears that there are some additional benefits associated when the animal's lying down and ruminating. I think it has to do with the Zen part of it, the meditation part of it all. So if a cow is standing up and ruminating, they're usually alert, they're usually moving around. Whereas when they're ruminating lying down, that's when the eyes kind of go down a little bit and they become that semi-sleep state with their eyes open. So that's for your FYI. I just saw that this month. Is that this month?
Yeah.
October. If anybody's interested, you get an email copy of that every month, or a hard copy. I prefer the hard copy, but I'm old school. Also, I got a thing from them for those of you sticking around for the 4-year. They do an advanced nutrition class in the spring. That's either 16 or 15 credits, and you could take that for your internship if you wanted to go up and spend a semester there. It's only offered in the spring. With some of you on accelerated time, that might be a challenge. So, nice place to be. Hopefully, as COVID goes away, we can take another field trip up there and take a look at what they have. I enjoyed it as a job, albeit it was only a temporary job. But when you're done, drop them off in the front and you're free to go. Thanks for showing up today.